All right, friends, welcome to the Blessed Family. I'm your host, Jared Dodd. As always, so good to be with you. Friends, we have a special treat today. My church here, we're doing a series on quote-unquote end times theology, eschatology. And if you follow this podcast, we just did kind of an opening introductory lesson just a few days ago. Well, my son Jared taught our church this last Sunday, and I tried to record it. The recorder didn't work, so I asked him to come on and give it to us again. And so he is going to be giving us a very key, important teaching straight from the words of Christ in Matthew 24. Would encourage you to open up your Bibles, follow him on this. It's going to be really good. So blessings to each of you. Without further ado, here is my son, Jared. Enjoy.
Hello, friends. My name is Jared Dodd II, and today we're going to be continuing our series on end-time theology. Today we're going to be looking at a passage of great importance on this subject, Matthew 24, and if you want to follow me today, you can turn to that passage. Now, just in introduction, I wish to answer the question that would be raised in a lot of people's minds on why we're not looking at the book of Revelation here at the beginning of our study after the introduction. And because Revelation's obviously a book about end times, there's a lot of symbolism and a lot of apocalyptic imagery and deconstruction language, and there's a lot of, you read it and you can tell this is about end times. And the question I would like to pose is the end of what time? The end of what time? Is it the end of the time, like the end of the world time, judgment of God, all that, like the futurists would say? Or is it the end of a certain age, the age of Judaism, around 70 AD? And of course, to answer that question, we have to look at the book of Revelation, right? And understand it. But then we turn to that book, and it's a very difficult book to understand because it's, like I said earlier, symbolism, and everything's a symbol practically. There's hardly anything in it that you can just read straight forward and be like, oh, okay, that's what that means. He says there's locust, it's locust. Like the futurists looked at the locust, with breastplates of armor and their wings beat like eagles, and they're like, oh, Apache helicopters. And so, the preterist looks at that and says, oh, it's this army, or, it's not actually locusts. And so the thing is where we got to look at the first 65 books of the Bible to get an understanding of the 66th. The analogy I like to use is that on the subject of end times theology, excuse me, is that it's like there's 66 verses, and the last one is extremely difficult to understand. It's extremely symbolic, and you read it and you can't really get an understanding. You can almost have any interpretation you want on this last verse. But the first 65 verses are extremely clear, concise, pretty straightforward. Obviously, there's some confusing spots, but it's pretty straightforward. And so the advice that Dad gave on the last lesson, and that I would give today, is that we should look at the first 65 straightforward verses, get an interpretation of those, and then turn to the last verse. Instead of looking at the last verse, getting an interpretation of what it seems to say, and then fitting that interpretation in the first 65 verses. And so that's the way I think we should look at this. Getting an understanding, look at very important passages in the first 65 books of the Bible, and then going to the symbolic, apocalyptic last book of the Bible. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at, like I said earlier, Matthew 24, very important passage. So the disciples asked Christ 3 questions on the Mount of Olives in this chapter. Right after Christ has said that there's going to be no stone standing on Jerusalem, the disciples come to him and they ask 3 questions. When will these things be? And we'll ask and answer the question on what these things are. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And we'll look at those questions in depth in a little more in a minute. But first, I want to look and get the context of chapter 24. It's always important, context. Context is a very important thing, always looking at the chapter before, even the first 4 chapters before, several verses before, just to get a context on what the passage is about instead of just jumping into it. And so to do that, we have to look at the first early passages, mostly chapter 23, but starting more in about chapter 21, Christ comes into Jerusalem, and then he cleanses the temple. The authorities challenges. He gives parables about the Pharisees. You have the parable of the two sons, the parable of the tenants, saying that they're going to be destroyed. He answers their questions. The Sadducees' question about the resurrection. He gives the parable of the wedding feast. Then we come to chapter 23. And in this chapter, Christ gives these Pharisees and scribes one of the greatest chewing out in history. I mean, he totally just tears them apart. In this chapter, it's this long speech of his, just saying how they're hypocrites. He calls them hypocrites 6 times. 3 times he calls them blind fools and guides. And one time, it's very interesting. In verse 33, he says, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how can you escape being sentenced to hell?" And what he's referring to in this passage, at least what I believe he's referring to in this passage, what I've been taught, is that he's referring to, in Genesis chapter 3, God is cursing the serpent, right? And he's saying, the woman's seed and your seed will be at enmity. They'll be fighting against each other. You'll bruise his heel, but he'll crush your head. Now, the question is, who is Satan's seed in the chapter? In that chapter there. Who is Satan's seed? And I would say it's the Pharisees and the scribes during Christ's time. This is what he's referring to when he calls them serpents and brood of vipers. So this is some big stuff, calling them hypocrites. These are the leaders of the Jewish religious community. Calling them hypocrites, blind fools, blind guides, serpents and vipers. And at the end, he gives probably the greatest vindication of all. He says in verse 35, he says, "So that on you," talking to the scribes and Pharisees, "may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." And what are all these things? Well, it's the judgment of all the righteous blood shed from Abel, the first martyr in the Bible, to Zechariah, who was killed in the book of Chronicles. Now, what's very important to understand here, in the Jewish Bible, Chronicles is the last book of the Bible. It's kind of like an overview for the Jews. And so this is Christ taking the last martyr in the Jewish Bible and the first martyr and saying, these are the bookends. All the blood shed from them in between is going to come on this generation. The judgment's going to come on this generation. It says in verse 36, "Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." Then for the rest of the chapter, for the next 3 verses, he gives a lament on Jerusalem, saying how often he's tried to bring them back, but they've killed his prophets, and just lamenting over what's going to happen to this city. Then after this chewing out, you could say, Christ, in the beginning of chapter 24, he leaves the temple. Now that we got our context, we can look at this. Christ is leaving the temple after giving this speech. And the disciples are starting to point out, the buildings of the temple, maybe to decompress the situation. I mean, it's probably pretty tense at the moment. But they're pointing out the temple like, hey, look at this temple. Ain't it great? Doesn't it looks pretty good. The temple of Herod was massive. It was one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world. And Christ says, "You see all these? Do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be here one stone upon another that will not be torn down." Christ says this temple, it's going to be gone. And we know for a fact that was fulfilled in 70 AD. Now, this is the verse that the futurists and preterists, the futurists being those who believe that the majority or most of biblical prophecy is future, and the preterists, those who believe, preterist being Latin for past, those who believe that most of the biblical prophecy is past, they agree on what this verse means, for the most part. They agree that this is Christ prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. For the preterist, he continues to talk about the destruction through the rest of the chapter, but for the futurist, this is Christ proving to our generation today that he can prophesy correctly. Right? Because they believe that the rest of this chapter about the abomination of desolation, the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven with great power and glory, gathering the elect, this is all end time stuff. the end of the world stuff. And so they believe, hey, Christ is just proving to our generation today that he can prophesy. He prophesies about the destruction of Jerusalem. He's proving to us that the rest of this chapter will come true because it's future prophecy. The preterist says, well, now hold on. We've got the context of 23. He's saying he's going to judge the scribes and the Pharisees. Then he comes and he says the temple's going to be destroyed. We would say, as preterists, which is the position I take, that Christ continues to talk about this destruction in the rest of the chapter, and we'll look at why we think that. But first, I want to make a quick distinction on preterists. When I say I'm a preterist, believing that most prophecy is past. I obviously do believe that some is future. I'm not a full preterist. There is a distinction in the camp. There are the full preterists and the partial preterists. The full preterists are those that believe everything's past. The final judgment, the resurrection of the dead, everything has already happened, roughly around 70 AD. And so we're living on the new heavens and new earth. The partial preterist, though, believes that we're in the millennium right now, depending on who you talk to, that we're in the millennium or we're about to be in the millennium and the judgment is to come. So just to make a distinction, I'm in the partial preterist camp. But coming now to the beginning of the three questions, Christ leaves Jerusalem in verse 3. He comes up on the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives is very important. It's just to the east of the city of Jerusalem. It's just the east of Jerusalem. And this is the same spot in the book of Ezekiel when the presence of the Lord leaves the temple in the book of Ezekiel. He comes up onto the Mount of Olives, gives judgment on the city of Jerusalem, and then leaves. And that happens in the book of Ezekiel. So now Christ, he gives a talk to the scribes and Pharisees saying all this judgment's going to come on this generation. He leaves the temple, comes up on the Mount of Olives, and then the disciples come and ask him three questions. Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and end of the age? So let's look at these. When will these things be? What are these things? For the futurist, these things are like the disciples asking about something, like the destruction of Jerusalem, and then Christ sort of answers their question, but it's meant for us. I would say when it says these things, they're talking about the judgment that's coming on this generation, the destruction of the temple. We have to understand, as Christians today, this is something that sort of passes by us. We don't really catch it. For the Jew, when you look at Old Testament prophecy, the temple was the only place to worship, right? In John, when Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, she says, you Jews believe that the temple is the only place to worship. And so the destruction of the temple for the Jew meant that it was there's no more place to offer burnt sacrifices. There's no more place to worship the Lord. And that means that the Messianic kingdom has come. So when Christ says the temple is going to be destroyed, the disciples are like, whoa, big stuff. You know, this is the Messianic kingdom coming. And I'm talking about Messianic kingdom, Mashiach coming. And for us Christians today, when you look at the Revelation, this would be the millennium, the age of peace and the conquering of the Messiah. And so the disciples say, hey, when will these things be? When will be the destruction of the temple? When will be this new setting up? And what will be the sign of your coming? Now, what's very interesting to note, and if you want to get a deeper understanding on this subject, there's a book I can recommend. Even though I have some disagreeing with some of the ways they interpret these passages, it's very good. Victorious Eschatology. I can't remember the name of the author off the top of my head, but Victorious Eschatology. Extremely good book. It talks about Matthew 24, Revelation, Daniel, all from a partial preterist view, the view that I stand on and is being espoused today. And so if you want to get deeper in this subject, I would greatly suggest that book. Another good book on Revelation, I don't know if Dad has already talked about this in the Lax lecture, but Revelation by Steve Gregg, I believe the man's name is, where he looks at Revelation from every single interpretive view. The futurist, the preterist, the idealist, the historicist. He looks at all of them, how they interpret every single verse through by through, non-biasly. He doesn't say, now this is what I think they believe. He looks at what the leaders of these communities believe and puts their interpretations in there. So if you want to get a deeper understanding of Revelation, all the interpretations surrounding each verse and how they can be interpreted in all these crazy different ways, I would greatly suggest that book for future reading. But coming back to the question on when will be the sign of your coming, we have to understand once again from the disciples' viewpoint, right? This is disciples asking Christ. Christ is going to give them a direct answer to the disciples. And they ask him, when is going to be the sign of your coming? Now, for us today, we think Christ's coming equals his second coming, right? His coming on the clouds in judgment, his wiping out evil, end of the world. But for the disciples, when they ask this question, they aren't thinking Christ is going to die, right? For them, Christ dying is like the weirdest thing on earth. It would be like, what? No, that's not going to happen. Christ isn't going to die. Jesus isn't going to be crucified and ascend into heaven. He's here. He's going to set up his kingdom here, and he's just going to go on living. That was their worldview, because that's the worldview of the Messiah from the Jewish perspective at that time. And so when they say the sign of your coming, they're not thinking about a second coming. They're thinking about the coming of his kingdom. So it's not when is your second coming from heaven, it's when is the setting up of your kingdom? When are you going to come into your kingdom? And then their third question is of the end of the age. Now, in the King James, this is interpreted world. This word can be either interpreted, in the Greek, it can be either interpreted as age or world. And so the question that we're going to look at later in this series is that words should be interpreted age or world. And obviously there are interpretations for both sides, on how they interpret this verse from either word, like the end of the Jewish age, entering the church age, or is it the end of the world, the physical world? And we'll get into that later. But first, coming into Christ's answer to these questions, he starts answering with the first one, when will these things be? And I'm going to interpret this from the viewpoint, this is them saying, when is going to be the destruction of Jerusalem and judgment on the scribes and Pharisees? Christ says, and starting in verse 4, and Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Now, this is not Christ's full answer to the first question. He continues to answer this question to about verse 28 or so. But I want to point out something interesting in this first section. There's an interesting book, a very well-written book by Dr. I believe his name's David Jeremiah. And he wrote a book called The World of the End, which is taking this passage and other passages of Scripture from a futurist viewpoint. And what's a fascinating point that he brought up that I'd never thought about before, and is very important, I believe it's true, and it's one of the most important things to this discussion, is in these 8 verses, they line up exactly, perfectly, for the most part, to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, even though I disagree with his interpretation of who the first one is, I would say that the first horseman is Christ. But from his interpretation, it's the Antichrist. So let's look at this. We see, many will come in my name saying, I'm the Christ. So we have an Antichrist. Then the second horse is the horse of war. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars in verse 6. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And then the third horseman of the apocalypse is famine, right? And we see there be famines and earthquakes in various places. And the fourth horseman is death. And obviously, if there's famine and war, there's death. We see later on there's tribulation and the disciples being put to death, Christians being put to death, slaughter with the abomination of desolation. And so it lines up perfectly. And at first, when he brought up this point, I was stunned. I was like, wow, this is very important, because wherever we place Matthew 24, then, if this is true, because we interpret Revelation by what we see in the rest of Scripture, and if the four horsemen of the apocalypse fits in to Matthew 24 here perfectly, then wherever Matthew 24 is fulfilled in history, their revelation is fulfilled. And that's why this is so crucially important. Because I do agree with Dr. Jeremiah. When he said it, I was like, wow, this is right. The four horsemen of apocalypse line up. And this means that wherever we put wherever we put Matthew 24 in the history, we should put Revelation. Of course, he went on to say that, therefore, if they're the four horsemen of the apocalypse, Matthew 24 is future. I would argue here, though, that Matthew 24 is past, and therefore Revelation, the majority of it, the first 19 chapters, is also past. But we'll get into why I think that in a minute. As we go through this chapter, we'll work in verse by verse on seeing how this can be interpreted by the destruction of Jerusalem in 780 and that historical viewpoint. So, but diving in here, Christ says, let no one lead you astray, for many will come in my name saying, I'm the Christ, and they will lead many astray. Now, during this time in history, right after Christ comes, right after he ascends, there were many, many, many false messiahs and heretics as well. In the church and outside of the church, there were people saying, I'm the Christ. Outside the church, if you take away those quotation marks in the passage, because the tricky thing about Hebrew is there's no like punctuation. So the question is, should those quotation marks around I'm the Christ be there or not? Because if they aren't there, then these people are people outside the church saying that they're the Messiah. If they are there, then these are heretics leading people astray. But after the ascension of Jesus, both these things happened. There were many heretics. Think of like the Gnostics, people such. Paul writes about them. John writes about them. Peter, what Paul terms the super apostles, right? And also a massive influx of false messiahs. Moving on, it says, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See you that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. Now, for the disciples, when we think of the ancient world, we think of civil war, barbarians attacking, wars all over the place. And so we're like, wow, hear of wars and rumors of wars. This is a future thing. Because today we live in a relative time of peace. Obviously, right now there's a lot of tension with foreign policy and even internally in the United States and other countries as well. But for us, we say, for them, there are always wars and rumors of wars. This must be future. But not so. For at this time when Jesus said this was right in the center of the Pax Romana, which is roughly about 100 years or so of peace, total peace in the Roman Empire. There weren't barbarians attacking because they knew the Romans were rough and tough, which the Romans were. And there was no internal strife until the time of Nero and Claudia and some of those later emperors who were a little crazy in the head. But at this time for the disciples, this is crazy. Wars and rumors of wars. Obviously in Judea, there were false messiahs popping all over the place. But for the rest of the Roman Empire, there wasn't much going on. And for the disciples, this would have been crazy news. You're hearing wars and rumors of wars? They heard of wars. They saw wars. But rumors of wars, there weren't any of those. Until the time of Nero, roughly around 70 AD. Christ says, see you not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and was not happening at this time. There was no war with like the barbarians or the Parthians until the year of four emperors, roughly around 70 AD. Well, actually, during the time 69 to 70 AD, the year of four emperors. In 1 year, there were four emperors that ruled consecutively. Because what happened was Nero died. There was no successor because he killed his wife, he killed his kids. He was crazy. And what happened was in the Roman army, one problem with the Roman Empire was that the army was not loyal to the emperor or to the empire. They were loyal to whatever general was in charge of their legion. So all these 4 emperors that fought in these years were generals of the Roman army, at least to the best of my knowledge. And practically it was civil war between these 4 guys. And one would win, then he was killed, then another would win, and he was killed, and then the third one, and he was killed. And then the 4th, Vespasian, who was besieging Jerusalem, he left and took power and started the next dynasty of Roman rulers, and his son Titus finished out the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Moving on to the last half of verse 7, we see, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Now, obviously at Christ's death, there was an earthquake, and continuing in that period for the next about 70 years or so, there was a explosion of volcanoes, literally and figuratively, of volcano eruptions, of earthquakes. A lot of stuff was happening. The earth was shaking up pretty bad during this time. So there were a lot of earthquakes in various places and famines. In Acts 11:28, we read about, of the collection for the famine in Jerusalem. All through Paul's letters, we see him asking for the collection for the poor and needy in this place, or he's reprimanding people for not helping the famine in this place, mostly in Jerusalem, which is fascinating. Because this is, from my point of view, the location of this chapter is mainly in Jerusalem. We have an earthquake at Christ's death. We have a famine in Acts 11:28. And Christ says, but all these are the beginnings of the birth pains, right? It's like the worst thing we can ever imagine. False Christ, wars, civil war all over the place, kingdom fighting kingdom, famines and earthquakes. But this ain't all, folks. There's more to come. Then they will deliver you, starting in verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now, what I want to point out here, and also what appeared in the beginning of chapter in verse 4 and 6, and what's going to pop up later in verse 15, is Christ's usage of the word you. Verse 4, see that no one leads you astray. In verse 6, you will hear of wars. See that you are not alarmed. Then coming to verse 9, they will deliver you up to tribulation, put you to death. You will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. The fascinating thing here is this is Christ speaking directly to the disciples. The disciples privately, we read this earlier in the chapter in verse 3, they privately come to Christ, and Christ is saying, hey, you're going to be put to tribulation. You'll see this, you'll see that. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel in verse 15, you will be led to tribulation. You will be put to death. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. This is to the disciples. We understand, when it comes to like the epistles, that they're written for them at that time, like the Corinthians and the Colossians, but also for us. But this speech here that Christ gives in 24 and 25, chapter 24 and 25 of Matthew, and also in Mark 13, Luke 21, it's directly to the disciples. The disciples come and ask a question, and instead of giving them a letter on Christian doctrine, like the book of Romans, Christ directly answers this question with, you will see this, you will see that, this will happen, you will see it, etc., etc., etc. And also, we see in chapter 23, and in 2 places in 24, this will come on this generation. This generation will see this. These things will come quickly, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. Verse 29. We see this you're just waiting for this to happen. Christ is like, this is going to happen on this generation. And a generation defined biblically, if we look at like the book of Numbers, is roughly 40 years. Right? The people of Israel rebelled in the book of Numbers, and God said this generation is going to die off. 40 years later, they're all dead. So the disciples, and we can expect this as well, to see the fulfillment of about half of Matthew 24, and then Christ does talk about the final judgment in 25. But we can see most of this fulfilled in chapter 24, We can see most of what is spoken of in chapter 24 and 23 fulfilled in the first 70 or the 40 years after Christ's death in 33 AD or 27 AD. We can expect to see this happen. But going back to Scripture, obviously, I don't think anyone would argue that the disciples were not delivered up the tribulation. They were not put to death. They were not hated. Obviously, we are, but not as much as they were. And talks about many will betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets, verse 11 and 12, this is very important. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. Two passages I'm going to turn to right quick. The first is 1 John 4:1. Beloved, do not believe any spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. John says here that many false prophets have come into the world. Verse 11 of Matthew 24, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. Turning to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who brought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. Peter says, hey, there's going to be false teachers here. There are going to be false teachers. And that's what we see here in verse 11 and 12. Many false teachers, the love of many growing cold. We look at the letters to the churches of Asia Minor in Revelation. One of them was about how the church, you're doing perfectly. I don't remember that. It might have been Laodicea. I don't remember for sure, but Christ tells them, you guys are doing perfect. You guys are like spot on, except you forgot your first love. You forgot your first love. Your love has grown cold. He doesn't say that there, but your love has been lost. You don't love the same thing you used to like you did. And then finishing that section out with verse 13, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Obviously, the one who endures the tribulation, the death, the false prophets, the falling away, the betraying one another, the lawlessness, and keeping that love, they'll be saved. Then verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Then the end will come. Now, one thing I do want to point out, if this is future, we can expect the end of the world to not be soon because of this verse. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. All nations have not heard. There are people groups who have not heard. Like New Tribes Missions, which is now called Ethos 360. Their whole goal is practically to reach tribes that have not been reached. I don't know if it's to the sole purpose of quickening this to happen, but that's their goal. This huge mission, they do wonderful work, is designed to focus on tribes that have not been reached. So obviously the whole world has been reached. And so as a future perspective, if I was a futurist, I'd say that the end will not be soon. But from a past perspective, how do I interpret this verse? As a preterist, how do I interpret this? Being that back then, the whole world, only practically the Roman Empire was reached. And barely that. At this time, Christ is telling them, hey, this gospel will reach the whole world, when right now it's like him and 12 other dudes is all that there is. Two things I want to point. One, a massive amount of verses in the New Testament that touch on this, the whole world being reached. And second, the use of the word world. In the Greek, the word world there, in the Greek it means civilized. So this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole civilized world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And with that in mind, civilized world, I want to flip to a number of passages in Romans and Colossians where Paul talks about the gospel of the kingdom having reached the whole world. The first here would be in Romans 1, verse 8, where Paul says, first, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed in all the world. Your faith is proclaimed in all the world. Now, can he really mean the whole world, or does it mean the civilized world, the Roman world? It's the same word there in Matthew 24, Romans 1, and also here in Romans 10, verse 18. Paul is quoting an Old Testament passage where he says, "But I ask, have you not heard? Indeed they have. For," quote, "their voice has gone out to all the world, and their words to the ends of the world." Their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. In this passage in Romans 10, they're talking about have people heard? Have people heard the gospel? And Paul says yes, because quoting from the book of Psalms 19:4, he says, "Their voice has gone out to all the earth, their words to the ends of the world." Also, we see in Romans 16 verses 25 and 26. Paul says, "Now to him who's able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret for long ages, but has now been disclosed, and through the prophetic writings has been made known to all nations, according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith." Here Paul is saying the gospel of Christ has been revealed through prophetic writings to the whole world. And there's even probably the most clear passage on this subject is the book of Colossians. The book of Colossians here. In chapter 1, verse 23, Paul writes, "If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister." It's like, whoa. The hope of the gospel has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven? So in many places in the New Testament, those being primary ones, we see that the gospel of the kingdom at the writings of these letters, which is before 70 AD, has been proclaimed throughout the whole world. With that in mind, we can expect the end would come shortly. Now we jump into one of the most interesting passages, the Abomination of Desolation. This is from verse 15 to 28, and I would say that this is about the tribulation during the siege of Jerusalem, and we'll see why in a moment. But it says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place," let the reader understand, "then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down and take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Look, he's in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Look, he's in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." Here we see a passage on a great tribulation. A great tribulation, right? It says in verse 21, "For there will be a great tribulation." And verse 29 says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days." So this passage here is speaking of a tribulation. Now, what tribulation is that? Now, of course, we obviously have to get time context. When is this tribulation? Well, we could say it's roughly soon after the writings of Paul's letters, because the gospel had been preached to the whole civilized world, and the end will then come, like it says in verse 14. So what is the abomination of desolation? What is it? Well, one way we can find out is flipping to chapter 21 of the book of Luke, which is a correlating passage of the Olivet Discourse. The one in Mark would be chapter 13. we come to Luke 21 and looking down to verse 20. Before verse 20, Christ has been talking about what we saw in the first 14 verses of Matthew 24 about this deceiving and the nations rising against the nation, kingdom against kingdom, and famines and earthquakes and tribulation and death and all that. Verse 19, by your endurance you will gain your lives. Then we come to verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know its desolation has come near. Now let's look at verse 15 of Matthew 24. When you see the abomination of desolation here in verse 20 of Luke 21, it says desolation, is surrounding a holy place. Now that word, that term holy place in the Greek, it doesn't mean a building. It means like a desert place, a holy place, or a location, a broad location, which I would interpret to be Jerusalem. One, because I believe the Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem, because of what it says here in verse 20 of Luke 21. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know its desolation is near. And then he goes and continues on and talks about what we just read in the passages. Those in Judea flee to the mountains. There will be great distress and wrath against the people, etc., etc., etc. Now, with this in mind, going back to Matthew 24. With this in mind, that the abomination of desolation is the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem. The reason I would say it's the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem is because if you look shortly after Paul writing the letters, the gospel being spread in all creation under heaven, Jerusalem surrounded by armies, 70 AD, is the nearest time frame we can see. And also, this isn't, I wouldn't say just a random interpretation of my own. We look at the early church's understanding. I mean, think about the early part of Acts, right? Like, it was a fad to sell your land. Like, the land around Jerusalem, like, I don't know, the real estate market, it's crazy right now in Texas. But think about what it was in Jerusalem. I mean, the Christians, all these converts are just selling their land. They're just selling it, and giving away the money. And I can't imagine what it was for the real estate agents of that day. It'd been crazy. All these Christians coming, hey, I need to sell my land. Why? Real estate agents like, why are you selling your land? Like, what is this? Why are you guys all selling your land? And many early church fathers and church historians all say that it has to go back to this passage in Matthew 24. They say the reason which the church was selling their land wholesale was because of what they saw here. They saw, hey, Jerusalem's going to be surrounded by armies in the next 40 years. We got to sell it while the selling's good and get out of here. Because Christ told us to be ready to go. Eusebius, for instance. Spurgeon. The church was selling their land because they needed to get out of there. Moving on, we come to verse 16. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now notice here in the next 4 or 5 verses or so how specific this is in people group and location. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Judea. Let the one who is on his housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. Now, what do we notice here? There is Judea. As far as I know, there are not a lot of people in our day and age that are living on their housetops. Verse 17, right? But those who are on housetop, don't go in their house. I mean, like if you're in Texas and you're on your housetop, if it's winter, you're not used to cold, so you're going to either freeze to death, or if it's summer, you're going to be roasted alive. Because a lot of the roofs here are tin. And of course, if they're otherwise, they're still hot. It's excruciatingly hot here in the summers, which I like. But still, I'm not spending time on my housetop. And let those who's in the field not turn back to take his cloak. In this day and age, if there's a great tribulation of sorts, people are rarely turning back to get their cloaks, right? I mean, there's houses have heating. We really don't need our cloaks anymore. We just have the t-shirt, the jeans, and we're out. Boom. Grab your tennis shoes, son. We're out of here. And alas, women who are pregnant, those who are nursing infants in those days. In our age of modern technology and comfort, in the place of comfort, how big of a deal is this? Obviously, it's hard on women pregnant at any time, and then nursing infants at any time. But Christ says this is going to be really bad in those days. So whenever this is, for women pregnant and for those nursing infants, it's going to be really hard if you have to be on the run. Now, though, I don't know. It's not as hard as it was back in those days. Pray that your flight, in verse 20, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. Last I checked, I don't know, most Christians are not Sabbath keepers, right? In the strict sense of Sabbath in the Jewish context of it being Saturday. Most of us are not keeping the Old Testament law. And obviously that's another whole debate. Should we be keeping it? I think not. I don't think we have to. You can if you want to. I don't think we have to. But pray that your flight may not be in winter. Now in our age of modern technology, like I was saying earlier, our houses are heated. We can bring heat warmers with us. We have propane. We have all these certain things that can help us when we're on the move. When we're tent camping, we can heat our tents. Or we can wear sleeping bags that can go down to like negative 10 degrees. So this seems, from what we see in these 5 verses, that this is very much ancient world stuff. The Sabbath, we see the Sabbath for the Jews in Judea. Those who are not on their housetops. The Jews built their houses with, stairs going up to the housetop. If you've ever seen Chosen, you know what I'm talking about. You can go up on your housetops. Pray that your flight may not be in winter. In the ancient world, winters were tough, especially in Judea. Winters were tough because we didn't have the technology we have today. And so I'd like to make that point. It seems that Christ is not talking about today, but talking about a certain place and people in a certain time. It seems unrelevant to us, but very relevant to the disciples at that time. Moving on now in verse 21. We see, and then will there be a great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days were cut short. Now, one thing to notice is Christ says that this is the greatest tribulation of all time. There are 2 different ways to interpret this verse. The first way would be to take it literally, as Christ literally saying, this is the worst tribulation of all time. I believe you can interpret it literally or figuratively. Interpret it literally, this was a horrendous tribulation for the Jewish nation. We think about World War II, in 6 years, 6 million killed. At this time, in 70 AD, in 4 months, 1 million were killed. And after the destruction of Jerusalem, mass genocide happened throughout the Roman Empire against the Jewish nation. There are many historians, church historians, early church fathers, who say that this period was the end of the Jewish nation. Like the Jewish people as a nation were finished. The Jewish population tanked. And as a nation, as a people group, they were the vast minority. And still are to this day. I mean, the Jewish population obviously has grown. Now they have their own nation state. And another interesting thing to point out is how important is Israel, right? For the futurists, it's very important. What happened to Israel is extremely important. For the preterist, it's more like, well, we can have them as an ally. Because all this interpretation about the building of the temple and the Antichrist sitting in a temple in Israel and that being their headquarters, him making a treaty with Israel for 7 years. For us today, for preterists anyway, that's not as important. But coming back to the chapter, getting off the rabbit trail, going back to this great tribulation. So we can interpret it literally, because it wiped out the Jewish nation for 1,000 plus years until 1948. or we can take this figuratively. Now, how can we take this figuratively? Christ said that John the Baptist was the greatest man born of woman. I don't know anyone who would argue that Christ wasn't the greatest man. I think everyone would argue that Christ was, every Christian would argue that Christ was the greatest man born of woman. So what is Christ saying here? Christ is hyperbole, saying, look at John. He's he's the greatest man born of woman. He's such a great guy. Figure of speech. Using a figure of speech here. And so you can also say that he's applying this to this tribulation. That this will be a great tribulation. Hey, it's going to be a pretty important tribulation. This is going to be a pretty bad one. And an interesting thing to note, for the futurists, they say that this is future, and it is the last tribulation, right? But here in verse 21, we see, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. So Christ is expecting tribulations to come after this. My brother Isaiah pointed this out to me, and I was like, whoa. That's a really big point. Christ is telling them, hey, there's going to be tribulations after this one, but they won't be as bad. That's something we should put to note, keep in mind, that 70 AD, this could be in 70 AD. It's the kind of the point I'm trying to make around all this. And wrapping up, we come to the last part, verse 23 and 20 through 28, which I'm going to try and go through quickly. Then, which is during this tribulation, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arrive and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he's in the rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So what do we see? If at this time during this great tribulation, if anyone says to you, there's Christ, don't believe it. For false Christ and false prophets will arise. We read this in 1 John and 2 Peter. This is a historical fact. There were a lot of false messiahs. After the destruction of Jerusalem, there was a false messiah, I don't remember his name, but he led away roughly 250,000 Jews who were all killed by the Roman army. So there are many false prophets who will rise. They perform great signs and wonders. I like Christ says, so to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. He's like, if it's possible, but it's probably not. If it's possible to lead the elect, these guys could do it. And he says, see, I've told you beforehand. This is another point. You. He's talking straight to the disciples. I've told you beforehand. This is Christ saying, I'm letting you know. So when this comes, you can be ready for it. If they say he's in the wilderness, don't go out. If he's in his rooms, don't believe it. If this is a secret thing, like, it's like a scam. And the scam, hey, there's a secret deal nobody's heard about, but we have the in on it. So, hey, give us all your money, your Social Security, and your life insurance, and we'll let you in on it. There's people saying, hey, he's in the wilderness. He's in the room. Nobody knows about it. But if you come with us, you can be on the inside track of this Messianic kingdom. But Christ says, no, as far as the east from the west, when the lightning shines as far as the east from the west, that will be my coming. The coming of my kingdom will be like that. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures are gathered. And I say this would be like the end of Christ answering the question, when will these things be? When will the destruction of Jerusalem be? Christ's destruction of Jerusalem, it will be like the coming of my kingdom from the east, from the west, like lightning. You will see it. You will know it. Wherever the corpse is, the death of Jerusalem, there the vultures will gather. And two last points I want to make. One on the word vulture there. The vulture can be interpreted two ways, either vulture or eagle. As a vulture, it would make sense if there's corpses, obviously the vultures would gather. But the eagle, throughout history, many, many, many nations have used the sign of the eagle as their standard, right? Rome, Napoleon, Hitler, Germany to this day, America. We have the eagle as our standard. And so it can be interpreted eagle as well, which would correlate with the Roman armies. If you read Thayer's dictionary on this word, the third definition, I believe, is specifically to the Roman standard. It's like you have vultures as the first definition, eagles as the second, and as the third, you have the eagles on the Roman standard. So if you read it that way, wherever the corpse is, there the Roman armies will be. Wherever there's great slaughter, and if you read Josephus's Wars of the Jews on the siege of Jerusalem, it's some gruesome stuff. It's bloody stuff. It's terrible what happened during the sieges. It was truly one of the greatest tribulations. Corpses, lots of them. This correlates straight to that. And coming on the last point, to the Romans surrounding Jerusalem, it's an historical fact that we have that when the Romans came, they surrounded Jerusalem, and then they left for about a week. They left because there was like something happened and they had to leave for about a week. And all the Christians left. All the Christians got up and left. The Jews didn't, though, because Jerusalem was one of the greatest strongholds of the ancient world. All the Jews stayed, but all the Christians didn't believe in this. They said, this city's going to be destroyed. And it was a 3-year-long siege. It took forever to defeat Jerusalem. And the Jews realized that. They said, this is one of the strongest strongholds ever. We're going to stay. The Christians took out of it, though. And early church fathers, church historians say it was because of the warning that Christ gave in the Olivet Discourse. When you see the abomination of desolation, or in Luke 21, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the hills. Take out of there. Get the heck out of Dodge. And this is what the Christians did. They went to the city of Piraeus up in the mountains and hid out there until the end of the siege. And the war almost got there. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, they started spreading out, massacring Jews, and they almost got to that city. It wasn't the city of Piraeus. That's in Greece. What is the city's name? I don't remember off the top of my head. But they came to the city, and the Romans almost reached it in destroying the Jews, but it was cut short. Titus said, we're done, we're quitting, we're going home. And the elect were saved. I know this has been a rather long lesson. I apologize. I know I've been all over the place. I hope you could follow me in this adventure through Matthew 24, through the first 28 verses anyway. And we'll continue. This is only part 1. I'm sorry if I at all bored you with the way that I bounce around and the way that I can drag things out. I apologize. I'm a little slow. But over the future lessons, we'll see how Christ talks about the sun being darkened and the moon will not give its light after the tribulation. Now, if that's about 70 AD, what the heck does that mean? Concerning that day and the hour, no one knows, not even the angels, would be like the days of Noah. And in chapter 25, the parable of the virgins, the talents, and the final judgment. But we'll touch on that in lessons to come. But in closing, there's one question, one last question for today. Why does this matter? Why is Matthew 24 so important? Why is end times theology important? And it's because of the perspective it gives us of the future. If the futurist is right, if I'm wrong, and if the future is right, if this is all in the future, if Christianity is going to ultimately lose until Christ comes back and he bails us out, then all this work we're doing, all this hard work we're doing to save America through people like Ben Shapiro, Dennis Prager, Jordan Peterson, all these mission trips we're doing to save these people ultimately are going to fail. We're ultimately going to lose. And so would it not be better for us to just bunker down and train up our kids, and just have kids, train them up in the ways of the Lord so that they will follow Christ? And of course, slowly that gathering will be destroyed and taken down by the enemy. And then there'll be the last few Christians in their bastion. If you read Left Behind, right? They're in their small bastion getting massacred in Jerusalem, and they're up on the mountain city like it talks of here. When it says flee to the mountains, they flee to the mountains and left behind, and then Christ comes and saves them. And so should we have that view of history? That right now Christianity is seemingly losing. Will we keep on losing? Or, if the preterists are right, will Christianity ultimately win? And I don't mean ultimately win as in the end Christ is going to come back and destroy everything and defeat evil. because obviously we both believe that will happen. But will the church win? Will we be able to save America, to save the free world? There are 200 million Christians in China, true Christians in China. South America is becoming rapidly Protestant. South Africa is one of the greatest Christian bastions in the world today. Will these bastions of Christianity be destroyed? Will these communities be defeated by the enemy? Or will we win, slowly but surely, and bring the world under the kingship and lordship of Christ? That's why this subject matters. Because it shows us the steps we should take in the future. In closing, please stay tuned as we continue this teaching in the weeks to come. Thank you, and God bless.